So our next speaker will take us a little bit more into the detail of the top performing farms. His presentation, Graeme McConnell, is originally from a farming background in Dandaragan, and after some time consulting with Bank West, he joined Plan Farm in 1999 and is now a senior consultant and part of the Plan Farm management team. For those of you not from Western Australia, Plan Farm is a very large farm business and consultancy firm in Western Australia, and one of the features of their work is a fairly extensive annual benchmarking survey that's carried out particularly in the grains industry over there. Graeme's experience as a farm business consultant and his involvement in benchmarking has made him realise that while Western Australian farmers are generally a capable group, they often leave a lot of margin on the table, so I think there'll be a few interested to hear about that. He's here to tell us that if more grain growers can be as profitable as the top performers, this will have a big impact on the future of farm financing. So please welcome Graeme McConnell.
Good morning and welcome. It's great to be here. So, as Mick said, I've been asked to provide a West Australian perspective on farm performance, and I guess some of the structures and the impact on financing that comes about as a result of that. You are going to see some similarities between our work and the work that Karen's put up. So, and certainly some similarities in the returns. So, it's good to see they're at least consistent, which is great. So. Okay, I'm going to start by highlighting there is a lot of difference between producers and in every region and in every size as we go about. So what we're seeing in our survey data is that our top 25% of producers are generating double the returns, consistently generating double the returns of the average. And the bottom end guys, the bottom 25% of producers, are consistently around zero. And I think if you just take that slide in isolation, there's some really clear messages that come out of that. So now these are in the same rainfall, same soil type, same technology, very similar management systems, but what we're finding is that it's just small differences in management, and it's really the key of this, and the key of a lot of what I'll be talking about is small differences in management can make a really big difference if they're done correctly. And to demonstrate my point, when a friend of mine approached me and said, how do you feel about a 700-kilometre ride on a gravel road? It was a small thing that actually made the difference for us, and that was dual suspension. Eventually did that. For those who don't know, that's the Gibb River Road, which is in the northern part of WA, and it's a charity ride. Okay, let's get to the guts of it. So, Plan Farm, we're consultants to farmers. I'm Graeme McConnell. We've been providing management advice, financial, strategic advice to farmers for over 20 years. And the information we're going to present today essentially revolves around this document, which is the Plan Farm Bank West benchmarks. This is last year's cover. It comes from the benchmarking of our client group, as well as clients from Bank West and some other consultancies in WA, which are Bedbrook Johnson Williams, Dave Watson and David Falconer. And the information that comes out of these, or that goes into this document, is basically come out of our client planning meetings. So every year we sit down with our clients for the best part of the day to work out how they've gone the last 12 months. We do their strategy and their planning for the next year, budgeting, etc. Our industry and the type of farms that are in this report are dominated by the family farm. They're about 4,000 hectares as an average type size. They're more dominated by grains businesses than what they are by livestock businesses, and hence with what you'll see I'll focus on more of the grains information. They're typically about a $6.5 million equity, and they're largely funded by family equity and some debt. Righto, so most of the data I'm going to use will be 6-year data, as that first slide I showed you was. I've extended this one out just for a couple of reasons. One is it's the 9 years that I've got here is a longer time series data that I can use that actually keeps the same people in the top 25% and the same people in the top 25 at the bottom 25%. And hence the longer time series is why the final average return on capital numbers are slightly different. So our average guys here are about 3%, it's actually about 3.5%. Our top 25 are about 7% long-term return on capital. And when we break that into years, we can see that, for example, our average group, they range from about -2% return on capital to really good years when they get up to about 8%. So there's quite a bit of variability in there. But when we look at the top 25%, we see that in the poor years, for example, a 2006 or a 2009, their poor returns are actually only a little bit better than the average. But when you get to the very good years, say a 2008 or a 2011 or even a 2013, the level of returns that they generate are a long way in front of the average. So what these guys are doing is they're very, very good at capitalising on those good years when they come through. This is probably one of the few slides I'll actually show some of the 2013 data. It's from a preliminary run of the data, so we'll release that in August once we get the rest of the consultants' data in. But 2013 in WA was a fantastic year. So, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. Okay, so I've spoken a bit about return on capital. So that's cash flow return on capital. I did want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about what's happened with land values, because obviously land values are the key part of the asset that forms the farmer's asset, if you like, and it's actually been returning pretty well as well. This data comes from Landgate, which is our valuer general in WA, and what it shows is since 1970, because some of those numbers are fairly small, we've had about a 6 to 7% return on capital, depending on which shires you look at. The blue line is one of our eastern wheatbelt shires, it's Merredin. The orange line is Goomalling, which is in our medium to high rainfall type region. And you can see a real adjustment in land values at that time. But the other key point in here is that, and I've just picked 2005 as a starting point, but from 2005, we've had very little growth in our land values. So there's two really key points here. One is we've had really good long-term consistent growth, but the last 10 years have been pretty ordinary. And if we're trying to look for reasons as to why that might be, this has come from some of our wheat yield data from 1961, I think it is, through till now. And I've just used some really rough Excel trend lines to show you where that's going. But probably up until the early 2000s, or probably up until the mid-90s, we've had pretty good growth in production. And then when we get to about 1990, our production seems to have levelled out, or our wheat yield increase has seemed to have levelled out. And we also seem to have taken on much, much more volatility. So we're having a real change there. So I think if we're looking for some of the reasons why our land values have levelled, and we'll talk a bit more about some of the difficulties we've had in WA in the last, let's say, 7 to 10 years, I think this lies at the heart of it. So, let's extend that a bit further, our climate. I've just picked out the last 4 years of our growing season rainfall, or roughly our growing season rainfall. And you'll notice that in 2010, we had our driest year on record for a large part of the state, and decile 1 for pretty much the rest of it. So just about one of our worst years ever. In 2011, we went to an average season in the better part of the state, so the southwest, usually the high rainfall, and they're the areas that can get too wet, so an average is great for them. Then when we get into the north and eastern areas of the state, it was wetter than average. So 2011 was a fantastic production year. It was also a fairly poor price year, so it was an okay profit year, but not a great profit year. Then in 2012, we went back to decile 1 and decile 3 for those areas that didn't have decile 1. So you're starting to get a feel for the variability we've been seeing in our production. 2013, pretty much an average year, but when you broke it down, we virtually didn't have any rain from the beginning of June until mid-July. We had a lot of farm production that was looking like it was really hanging in the balance in that July period. So last year, even though it ended up being one of our most profitable years on record, could have been very much either way. We're just very lucky we had a kind finish, and we were lucky enough to carry through the season that we had. Now, the impact of this variability that we're seeing, I've used this chart a bit, and some of you may have seen it before, but it's really looking at our debt levels and our equity. So we're seeing since the mid-90s, our farm debt levels per hectare in the orange bars have been increasing quite rapidly. And it was a cause of great concern for us. And the corresponding equity percentage in the black line, you can see, was actually decreasing. And this is against the background of increasing land values, certainly in the earlier part of this. Now, without this opportunity to recapitalise in 2011 and 2013, and the 2013 data, as I said, is preliminary, I think we'd be in a power of strife, or potentially, in terms of our average group. So it's one of those things that I think our returns look pretty good, it all looks pretty healthy, but we've been, I think, sitting very close to the edge, and a lot closer to the edge than a lot of us would like to be for quite a while. Okay, so let's get back to my commentary about little things. And what this chart is it shows in the green the top 25% production for each of the rainfall regions, and I'll talk a bit more about those in a sec. The averages in the orange and the blue is the bottom 25%. And really what it shows is that in every region, the top 25% are generating about double the returns of the average. And you know, they're obviously doing something differently. They've obviously worked out how to farm quite well in this environment that we're dealing with at the moment. Whereas if you look at the bottom 25%, look, I think a lot of those are going to really struggle to survive unless they change or unless they can learn how to adapt to this environment. Okay, the regions. So you would have noticed the H's, the M's and L's. The H's relate to our high rainfall zones. This is effectively our Department of Agriculture map. The M's are the medium rainfall, L's are the low, the 1s and the 2s are in the north of the state, and the 3, 4, 5s are in the south of the state. And in the next few slides you'll see where that comes to play. So if we start looking in detail at our top 25%, what I've done here is I've gone and highlighted in green the years where we've had a greater than 10% return on capital. So if you're in a high rainfall zone in our state, we can expect that, well, in the last 6 years we've seen that you've had a 10% return on capital or better year 1 in 6. But all the other years are actually pretty consistent within reason. The medium rainfall and the low rainfall zones, we're seeing roughly 2 years in 6. And 2013 will again, as I said, prove to be another plus 10% year for these guys. But as you get into the medium and low rainfall, what you see is there's a few people picking up on the 41%. Maybe I'll talk about that in a sec too. But what you'll find in those regions is that you'll see, one, they don't make losses very often. In fact, they're very, very good at avoiding losses. In the average years, they generate a really good average return on capital. They don't try and kill the pig. And in the best years, they seem to be able to capitalise on those incredibly well. And probably the best case in point, as I said, a few people have already picked up on, is a 41% return on capital in the L1 and L2 zone. Now that's a low rainfall in our northern wheat belt, and that was in 2008. It probably would have been the same in the low rainfall 3, 4, 5, except we had a really good frost event in that part of the world, and that caned what was an otherwise outstanding crop in that year. Look, it was just a really, really good production year coupled with very, very good prices. And laid over a very low land value for that part of the world because that region had come off 2 of their worst droughts in history. So 2006 and 7 in the L1-2 zone were some of the worst droughts. So we'd actually seen a decrease in land values in that area at that time. So it was still a very, very good return. I probably won't touch on it in detail, but some of those businesses in that 6 years in that L1-2 zone have gone from about a $3.5 million equity to about a $7 million equity in that time. Righto. So let's start breaking down this production thing. So what we've got is, if we look at our wheat yield for the top 25% compared to the average, pretty consistently they're generating about 0.1 of a tonne more. It's only 100 kilos, and it's actually not a lot. And I guess the example I've used for some of our farmers when I've been trying to describe this is, well, if you say 0.1 of a tonne at $260 a tonne net on farm, at about, that gives you about $26,000 for every 1,000 hectares of crop. And I'll use that theme as we go through. Our operating costs, the top 25% consistently spend about $22 a hectare less. So they're getting more yield and they're spending less to actually get it. But as you can see, in different regions, there's a different response. The M345 and the L345, they're actually spending more per hectare, but they're getting a getting a high yield as a result of that, so that's why they're the top 25%. But if you use that $22 figure as a base, for every 1,000 hectares, that's $22,000. And if you're following the maths, that takes us up to about 46. 48. And then if we look at our pricing equation for the top 25%, the best farmers in our group are generating consistently about $2 to $3 a tonne better prices for their wheat. So, as I said, I've just focused on wheat for this part of the example. But at, let's say, that $2 a tonne at a 1.5 tonne average crop, we're looking at about a $3,000 per gain per year for 1,000 hectares. So that takes us to a bit over our $50,000. And if we were trying to follow those numbers through, that makes, on an average of about a 4,000 hectare farm, that's about $200,000 additional profit they're generating a year. And on the 6-year analysis that I've used here, that should mean an equity change of about $1.2 million. And when we look at the farm equity gain, the differences in the farm equity gain for the top 25% relative to the average, our average farmers in that time for statewide have generated an equity gain of a bit over $1 million. Our top 25 guys have generated about 2.1 or 2.2. So it's pretty close to holding true. But you do need to remember there's been no land value, no land value change in that time either. So, and in actual fact, quite a few of these guys would have recorded a decrease in land value over the time of this data. So I think those numbers actually hold up pretty well. So for my mind, these small differences, this 0.1 of a tonne to the hectare. So yeah, so this 0.1 of a tonne to the hectare, the little bit of difference in operating costs, and the little bit of a difference in price make a hell of a difference to the profitability that we have there. So the questions for us. So they lie in where will the profitability gains for our top 25% come from now? Because they're obviously using the technology and the systems that are out there pretty well now. What can be done to get better outcomes for our bottom 25? Because there's clearly some guys there with some real issues. And from an industry point of view, it's trying to work out how we actually reduce the loss of skills as some of those people actually leave farming. Because there's actually some quite capable farmers in there. They just got some things in there that aren't quite right. Let's touch on some trends in farm financing from our perspective, because it's the other part of what we're asked to talk about. And I guess we're seeing some fairly obvious questions develop, bearing in mind that our businesses are based with a farm equity with a bit of debt that sits there as well. I guess we've had a very long history of ag financing, as you'd expect. We've had pretty low levels of innovation. The type of models that we're seeing now have been out there for a very, very long period of time. Our current financing structures, we believe, actually constrain those high profit, those high growth type businesses, and also those businesses that are really struggling with that variability that we're seeing in our seasons and our productivity. That's creating some real issues, and we're seeing that right across our client base. And it's also quite intimidating for any new entrants into the business. You know, we see, if you think about it, very, very few new entrants into farming, or certainly in WA, and I presume it's similar through most of Australia. So if I guess part of what we're looking to do is trying to find ways of actually getting that, to improve that situation. We've had a number of MIS schemes which have been pretty much universal failures as far as I'm aware. Our corporate agriculture approach has been okay, but it's not always been successful, and I think David's going to talk a bit about that in a while. So when we look at the pricing of our products, and I guess this is my belief, is that I think our pricing is generally quite high for agriculture relative to the amount of risk that we see in there. So if you think about the number of failures that we see in agriculture, even despite the variability, they're pretty thin on the ground. And certainly our top 25%, I think, have a very strong argument for a lower cost of finance when they can actually present this sort of thing, you know, to say they're actually a much lower risk business than what I think a lot of banks and others perceive them to be. So some suggestions and ideas we'll put out for maybe later in the conference, so that you know, financial products that are not reliant on loan-to-value ratios as a terminating level for financing. I guess the guts of this is when a farm has a tough year, which we're seeing quite a few of those, and are happening quite regularly now, the funding requirement increases, the security values decrease, and if you're not a business that's you know, if let's say you're a business that's slightly at risk, you can actually have that compound very, very quickly and create some real issues. Part of the answer to that might be P&I facilities with drought clauses, like really effective drought clauses in place that we're not seeing at the moment. We're starting to see some off-take arrangements, certainly in WA. CBH, our local bulk handler, has been using a product called Harvest Prepay, which effectively basically lends value against grain. It's about $100 a tonne for blocks of 500 tonnes of grain. And that's been working quite effectively. So it's not actually securing against land or any other asset, which is one of the things we're keen to get away from where we can. We're starting to see risk mitigation insurance coming through, which I think is a really good step, and fundamentally the idea is a very, very good idea. And one thing which has been touched on a number of times, and I'd like to make sure we see a fair bit more focus on this, is the separation of skill from the capital. So I think there's a really strong argument for those with the skill, which we're seeing through our benchmarking numbers, but there's also a strong argument for those with the capital to get quite a reasonable return out of it. So, yeah. So our actions, I think, as an industry, we have a great group of farmers, and generally with very, very good capacity. The top 25% of these have a pretty much assured future. I think they'll cope under whatever circumstances are put out there. We can also identify those at risk, and I think with a bit of effort we can get a lot better outcomes for those guys. It's a middle group that I believe that we can make the most difference to, and they're the guys that I would actually like to see given the opportunity to try and get up to the top 25%. And I think we're going to do that partly through training and making sure that these guys actually, one, know where they're at, but secondly, know what they can actually do to improve their position. And then when we get into our business structures and our financing options, look, I think our industry's right for innovation. And it's innovation for these, with longer term horizons, understanding the variability in the industry and coupling this with the ideas of, seeking mechanisms that, as I said, reward the skills and reward the capital and do that independently. Very good.